Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the University of Adelaide. My name is Jessica Gallagher and I'm the Deputy Vice-Chancellor External Engagement, and it gives me great pleasure to be your MC this evening. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the Kaurna people, the original custodians of the Adelaide Plains and the lands on which the University of Adelaide's campuses at North Terrace, Waite and Roseworthy are built. I would also like to acknowledge a number of distinguished guests who are joining us this evening, including Her Excellency, the Honourable Frances Adamson, Governor of South Australia, the Honourable Nat Cook, MP, Minister for Human Services, Minister for Seniors and Ageing Well, the Honourable Catherine Branson, AC, SC, Chancellor of the University of Adelaide, the Honourable Graham Ingerson, former Deputy Premier of South Australia, Professor Peter Hoy, AC, Vice-Chancellor and President of the University of Adelaide, Professor John Williams, AM, Provost at the University of Adelaide, Professor Jodie Conduit, Executive Dean of our Faculty of Arts, Business, Law and Economics, Emeritus Professor Adam Graycar, AM, Founding Director of the Stretton Institute, Mr Adam Liaw, our orator this evening, Ms Sally Dryden, daughter of Hugh Stretton, Mr Simon Stretton, former Judge of the District Court of South Australia and son of Hugh Stretton, Dr Danielle Wood, Chair of the Productivity Commission and 2024 Orator, Ms Elizabeth Ho, OAM, Chair, History Trust of South Australia, Mr Greg Mackey, OAM, Chief Executive Officer, History Trust of South Australia, Professor Alison Coates and Professor Patrick O'Connor, AM, this evening's commentators, and of course to all of you, welcome ladies and gentlemen. We're so pleased that you're able to join us here this evening. Thank you for joining us in our beautiful Elder Hall for the annual Hugh Stretton Oration. The Oration is an annual public lecture established in 2021 in honour of the late Emeritus Professor Hugh Stretton AC and is organised by the University's Stretton Institute. Hugh was one of our very great thinkers, a Rhodes Scholar who became the youngest professor in Australia at the time he was recruited to our university in 1954 as Professor of History. He was a rare and broad intellect worthy of celebration. Before I ask the Vice-Chancellor to personally welcome you all to the University, a few points of housekeeping. Firstly, if you need to use the restroom, please ask one of our events staff for directions. And in the unlikely event that we need to evacuate the building, please follow the directions of our staff. Could I ask also that you take a moment to check that your mobile phones are on silent? I would now like to invite our Vice-Chancellor and President, Professor Peter Hoy, AC, to say a few words of welcome and to introduce our orator for this year's event. Thank you.
Thank you, Jess, and thank you for welcoming us to country. Your Excellency, Chancellor, and all distinguished guests, which indeed I think is all of you. Good evening and a warm welcome to the University of Adelaide. I would like to acknowledge the members of the Stretton family with us tonight, Sally and Simon, as we continue to honour the memory of your father with the Hugh Stretton Oration for 2025. I also note that we have with us the 2024 Stretton orator, Danielle Wood, who just yesterday was awarded an honorary degree of Doctor of Economics honoris causa, our university's highest honour. Congratulations and thank you very much for making your alma mater look good. As indeed, there are so many people in this room who are working hard on and succeeding, I might add. Our orator tonight is one of Australia's best-known chefs, TV host and cookbook author Adam Liaw. A talented young student, Adam enrolled at our university aged only 16. By age 22, he held a Bachelor of Science Jurisprudence and a Bachelor of Laws honours. He began an upward career trajectory in law, culminating in a role as the Asia-Pacific head of legal and business affairs for Disney Interactive based in Tokyo. How his life shifted from there to here speaks to his decision to follow alternate passions. Now having published 9 cookbooks, hosted numerous television programs and toured the world as a chef, Adam is a star of modern Australian cuisine. Adam is also an experienced non-executive director in the fields of arts, education, and international relations, holding board positions with the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery, TAFE New South Wales, the Museum of Chinese in Australia, and the Australia-Japan Foundation. He has a strong belief in making good food accessible to all, and he's a vocal advocate for simple, approachable home cooking. As a UNICEF Australia ambassador, Adam champions campaigns to promote the power of good nutrition and the dangers of malnutrition, especially for children. His popularity is such that he has 2 million people following him on social media, and he is in great demand as a public speaker. We're honoured that he has agreed to join us tonight for this oration. The University of Adelaide plays a continuing significant role in food production for our state and beyond. Research conducted on our North Terrace, Waite and Roseworthy campuses has been central to the economic development of South Australia and our ability to improve food production. The challenges have varied over the past 150 years of the university's existence. The latest challenges involve our changing climate and the need to develop new crops and new technologies to ensure we can continue to flourish amidst changing conditions. Think, for example, about the drought conditions we have now. Currently, researchers at our Waite campus, in collaboration with Indigenous groups, are using Australian plant species to create sustainable food products. Waite researchers are also exploring how to grow plants to feed future space colonists. And earlier this month, Waite also hosted a sold-out Tasting Australia event featuring zero-waste culinary pioneer Douglas McMaster, who opened the world's first zero-waste restaurant, Silo, based in Hackney Wick, East London. It is pertinent, therefore, to have Adam Liaw share his views with us tonight about the need to question what good food is and how food policy should be regulated. Adam is a noted voice in this field and was a recipient of a University of Adelaide Distinguished Alumni Award in 2023 for his contribution to Australian food culture and advocacy for equitable access to nutrition. I'm looking forward to hearing him on his chosen topic, growing an appetite for good food policy. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Peter, and I'd also like to acknowledge the Kaurna people as the traditional custodians of this land. It is a huge honour for me to be asked to be here tonight to deliver the Hugh Stretton Oration for 2025. Last year, Productivity Commission Chair Danielle Wood spoke about the role of government policy in the rise of income inequality. The year before, the Honourable Mark Butler spoke about the challenges facing an ageing Australia. Tonight, unfortunately, I'm here to talk to you about spaghetti. Some may ask why I, as a cook, am here to give a lecture on policy. Do not worry, I've asked myself the very same question, most recently just before walking onto this stage right now. I first graduated from the University of Adelaide nearly 30 years ago now with my undergrad in science, before following that with my Bachelor of Laws a few years later. And can I just say, it's slightly unnerving having my con law professor sitting there in the front row. For about half my time since then, I worked as a lawyer. The other half, I've worked as a food writer and cook who also does a bit of stuff on the telly. To me, science is the process of understanding and making use of the natural world. Law is the process of regulation that governs correct behaviour within a society. And policy is the design of a course of action undertaken with the intent of producing an anticipated result. Food, I'm very glad to say, is the most direct combination of those three things. In modern society, we don't take food very seriously. Sad but true. Food is found in the lifestyle pages of our newspapers and on lifestyle networks on TV. That is where I spend the bulk of my career, writing affordable recipes that you can read over the breakfast in your morning paper, writing cookbooks that you can buy to change up your Tuesday dinner, or making TV shows where you can sit on your sofa and travel to Norway, China, Singapore, or Japan and feel inspired by the different ways that the food that we eat has manifested in the societies that we have created around the world. We consider food to be a bit of fun, light entertainment. In our latest election campaign, the question of food arose precisely once regarding a gaffe over the price of eggs. When I was graduating from law school here, as someone interested in food, I looked into whether there were areas of food law that I might be able to move into, only to be told there really wasn't very much of it, beyond general liability, product labelling, and recalls. The reality, however, is that for most of human existence, we have structured entire societies around food, and as such, most of the policy and regulation that human societies have placed on themselves has related to it. We can go back even further than civilization and society because at a biological and evolutionary level, the food that we eat is actually what makes us human. Let me start off with a cooking question. How do you make food taste good? To me, this is the threshold question on cooking, and it isn't asked nearly often enough. The answer is taste. Taste is the most important thing in cooking. As lay people, we don't understand taste very well. We confuse it with flavour. Flavour is the sum total of perception as it relates to our food, combining taste with things like aroma and texture. But at a scientific level, taste is very specific, and in fairness, slightly circular in its definition. We can define taste as the process of sensory perception, detection, and interpretation of chemical stimuli through taste receptors. Pretty dry, I know, but we have just 5 basic categories of taste receptors, which means that we taste just 5 things: saltiness, sweetness, sourness, bitterness, and umami. That combination of basic taste is fundamental to cooking, not just because it makes a delicious dish, but because those 5 tastes are the story of humanity itself. I'm not being dramatic here, I truly believe that. The basic seasonings that you have next to your stove might well mirror these tastes. You might have salt, sugar, maybe some vinegar or citrus, maybe some umami seasonings like stock powder, soy sauce, MSG, or Worcestershire sauce. It is the balance of these tastes that makes food taste good. If I can explain a little bit more, let me contrast it with aroma. Take something like coriander, mint, or parsley. It doesn't matter if you add a pinch or a kilo of things to your food, their aroma will make your food smell more or less like coriander, mint, or parsley. Those ingredients, while heavy in aroma, don't contain much in the way of molecules that affect taste. If you were to pinch your nose and try some coriander, parsley, or mint, they would taste largely the same, and by that I mean slightly bitter. Compare that with something like salt, sugar, or soy sauce that has molecules that are relevant to our taste. Add a pinch or a kilo of those to your food, and that will be the difference between food that tastes good or food that tastes very, very bad. Cooking has been the process of codifying our biological tastes into a methodology relevant to the way that our societies live. We think that things taste good because they have an evolutionary benefit to them. We taste saltiness because billions of years ago, every living thing on the planet crawled out of the same primordial soup, and that primordial soup was based in sodium. We share our taste with saltiness with just about every other animal because salt is how we regulate fluid and create the electrical impulses that allow some parts of our bodies to communicate with others. Fast forward a few billion years from that, and some of the life that had crawled out of that soup became primates, getting the majority of their calories from fruits and vegetables. Our taste for sweetness, short-chain carbohydrates, attracted us to sweeter, higher-calorie fruits, which gave us an evolutionary advantage over other primates who might not have been so lucky to have a taste for sweetness. If we had evolved from carnivores, we would perhaps have lost the taste for sweetness along the evolutionary path, just like so many animals have, things like sea lions, hyenas, and great cats. Even today, your beloved Moggy at home has no ability to taste the sweetness in a saucer of milk. It likes that milk not for its sweet lactose, but for its salts, fats, and proteins. And bizarrely, most adult cats are actually lactose intolerant. So even with just 2 of our 5 tastes, saltiness and sweetness, they've taken us across billions of years of evolution. But add sourness to that, and things get very specific. Somewhere along that evolutionary line, one of our primate ancestors had a mutation in its genetic code that prevented it from producing ascorbic acid in its cells. Ascorbic acid is what we call vitamin C. Now here's the important part. That mutation conferred no benefit to it, but similarly, that primate didn't die. It was getting enough of its vitamin C in the form of fruit and other sour foods that it never missed it because it had a taste for sourness. To this day, there are only a handful of animals that don't produce vitamin C within their own bodies. A couple of species of birds, guinea pigs, fruit bats, and anthropoid primates like us humans. That one genetic quirk that occurred millions of years even before humans existed means that we now love vinegary salad dressings and a squeeze of lemon on our fish and chips. Next is umami, the taste of savouriness that is triggered by amino acids like glutamate and substances like inosinate and guanylate. It was once thought that our taste for umami was a potential marker for protein, but modern scientific thinking hypothesizes that it is in fact a taste for food manipulation, a taste for cooking itself. The umami taste that we enjoy comes from plant, meats, and fish. It's a key part of our taste for breast milk. As omnivores, it's important in our preferences for a wide range of foods. In our cuisines, it's created by processes like cooking, fermentation, and aging, processes that kill harmful bacteria while, at least in the case of fermentation, allowing beneficial bacteria to thrive. A taste for umami created by food manipulation is an evolutionary advantage, making our food safer, more nutritious, more bioavailable, and populating our microbiomes with necessary and beneficial bugs. So with 4 of our 5 tastes now accounted for, the human story becomes even more clear. We are animals on Earth. We evolved from fruit-eating primates. Somewhere along the line, one of those primates lost the ability to synthesize vitamin C, but we are also omnivores who developed the intelligence necessary for food manipulation. Before I get to bitterness, one thing I'm often asked, and one thing that you're possibly thinking of right now is, what about spiciness? Isn't that a taste? And why is it that we like chili and pepper and olive oil and things like that? Spiciness has historically been considered a taste in many cultures, from Ayurveda in India to Chinese medicine. But the difference is that spiciness is sensed by receptors like TRPV1, nociceptors whose role is in the dissection of tissue damage, sending us signals for pain and temperature. This is why the capsaicin in chili and the piperine in pepper are described as hot. TRPV1 is also activated by ethanol, which is why we describe drinking whiskey or high-proof vodka as having a burning sensation. But the fact that spiciness isn't considered a true taste scientifically doesn't make it any less important to humanity. An aversive sensation like pain is a clear evolutionary advantage. But then the question you have to ask is, why do we like it? Why are these foods so popular? A taste scientist once described to me that the common preference for spicy foods is kind of like a roller coaster. It's exciting, and the evolutionary benefit of being just a little bit adventurous with our food is what has led human beings to every corner of the world to try new ingredients and thrive in more different environments than any other living species. Our last true taste is bitterness, and I think it tells the most beautiful story of what it means to be human. Bitterness is an aversive taste. It exists to tell us that something that we are about to eat might be poisonous, and if we just avoided bitter foods, that would be the end of the story. But we don't. Like spiciness, we love bitter foods and drinks. We love beer, brassica vegetables like broccoli, cabbage, and Brussels sprouts, bitter gourd, things like chocolate and the tea and coffee we drink religiously every morning. Far from being things that we avoid, bitter foods are the ones that we crave and form lifelong connections with. We don't start out like this. If you're a deer, a 4-legged deer, you're born and within about 10 minutes you can stand up on shaky legs. Half an hour later you can walk along, and within a couple of weeks you know that from the tastings eaten by your mother during your period of gestation, what is good to eat in the environment around you. Humans are very different. We have big heads that hold wonderful big brains, and that means that we are born essentially useless. I have 3 children, I can say that. It takes not minutes but years for us to learn to walk, and far longer to learn what to eat. And we only survive because we are part of a social unit, a family, a tribe, or a society. With the possible exception of chocolate, which is processed to be more sweet than bitter, children don't like bitter or spicy foods. But over time we learn to like them, a skill taught to us through observation and experience together with the people around us. It's an evolutionary arms race. Plants evolved to be more bitter so that fewer animals will eat them, and we animals in turn evolved mechanisms to learn to like that bitterness so that we can. Of course, these days we're cheating. Our brains are so big and we're so effective that we have been able to control plant evolution through agriculture, and we control the selection of genetic traits for bitterness, sweetness, and other tastes. The first thing that started you on your road to liking coffee was watching your parents drink a cup of it and not die. It seems ridiculous, but that information was hugely important to you, to your understanding of a thing that if you were just to taste it without context, you would assume, based on your sense of taste, that it was highly poisonous. Then years pass and you start to associate the morning smell of coffee with comfort. In your 20s, you have positive experiences with your friends going out to cafes, and then perhaps the buzz of caffeine when you start drinking it makes you feel a little bit happier. Tens of thousands of tiny instances occur, and before you know it, you're an adult, and the idea of going a day without coffee is absolutely terrifying to you. I often tell parents that if you want your kids to like vegetables, the best way to do that is to eat a Brussels sprout in front of them, not die, and wait 20 years. I'm not even joking, because in the arms race, vegetables, because of that arms race, vegetables are inherently bitter to varying degrees, and as a child, not liking the taste is not bad behaviour, it's biology. We know that these tastes can take years to learn through behavioural reinforcement of positive experiences. Conversely, the best way to get your kid to hate vegetables long into adulthood is to sit them down and force them to eat them. I've made thousands of episodes of food TV shows, and I've spoken with thousands of people about their food likes and dislikes, and I can tell you that almost every single food aversion can be traced back to a traumatic experience with that food in childhood, as if the job of being a parent wasn't hard enough already. Perhaps some of you are now wondering what all of this has to do with food policy. Well, the point is that for us humans, food is social. From our taste for umami leading us to food manipulation, spiciness allowing human societies to thrive in multiple environments, or learning to like better foods over decades as a familial or social unit, food policy, that is deciding what to eat, what's good for you and what's good for our society, is quite literally a part of our biology. Perhaps the earliest examples of food policies that we have were painted on cave walls tens of thousands of years ago. We may never definitively know why cave paintings were made, but what we do know is that the vast majority of them feature animals like deer, bison, and mammoths, herbivores that were the targets of early hunters, and not saber-toothed cats, lions, and wolves, predators that were likely threats or competition. Of all of the aspects of life that those artworks could portray, the way that humans interact in relation to food was the most important. Of course, the oldest continuous food culture in the world is right here in Australia. We know that there have been complex food rules in Indigenous culture for tens of thousands of years. Prohibitions on eating totemic foods that vary from clan to clan. Cultural practices of reserving certain foods or parts of animals for certain members of a group. I don't suggest that I speak for any of these cultural groups, but it's easy to see how these rules and policies could have been vital to ensuring not just the health of individuals and groups, but ongoing environmental and resource management. Food has also been ubiquitous in religious policy, from the prescriptions of eating kosher to foods that are considered halal or haram. Leviticus 19:10, you are not to harvest all the way to the corners of your field or pick every grape from your vineyard. Any grain that falls to the ground should not be gathered up. Leviticus 19:23, a tree planted for its fruit is not to be used for its fruit until its 3rd year of planting. In its 4th year, the fruit is dedicated to the Lord, and only in the 5th year can it be eaten. Food was such a focus of early law and policy that parts of the Bible really do sound a little like the Yates Garden Guide. Again, I do not speak for any of these religions, but you can quite easily make a case for why religions as the governing law for a society might be concerned with agricultural policy or health, or why religions that originated in the Middle East may have considered water-intensive pig farming as unclean, while religions that developed in areas with greater availability of water might not have retained those same prohibitions. I'm Chinese, and I started brewing rice wine when my wife was pregnant with each of our 3 children. That's what you do. You find out that someone's pregnant, you start brewing rice wine. And then you use that wine to cook what's known as confinement dishes after the children are born, things like stewed chicken with ginger. It's certainly not a religious, superstitious, or even nutritional belief to me, but as a cultural practice, this process of making wine, ladling it out into jars, getting it all over your hands and utensils, and cooking with it would have clearly been beneficial postpartum in a time before reliably clean water supplies and a scientific understanding of germ theory. Food has been a central source of power for most of civilization. In feudal Europe, power and wealth was measured in bushels of wheat. In China, it was unhusked grain measured in dan, shi, or hu. In Japan, provincial lords had their wealth calculated in koku, of rice. The common thread between these systems is that while these commodities may have been considered fungible economic units, they were ultimately centered around people. One koku of rice was roughly the amount of rice that a person would eat in 1 year. Commodities such as iron and gold were of course also traded, but ultimately power, whether political, military or economic, was a factor of people, and that made food a matter of ultimate importance. Through the agricultural and industrial eras, this is how things were, and it's only very recently that the basis of power has shifted from people to commodities like oil, capital, and more recently, information. The nations with power over these things are generally relatively food secure and mostly in surplus, so that the importance of food as a measure of power has fallen drastically in our society. Even up to a couple of hundred years ago, everything in human society centered around food. Nearly every festival or key event celebrated harvests, equinoxes, and other agricultural happenings. It was once left as offerings to the gods, but now we see food as an imposition, a chore. Cooking is something that we do begrudgingly. We try to avoid it as much as possible. This is not a lecture about economics, but politicians and policymakers will always be concerned with power, and the ability to provide food is no longer the measure of it for the most powerful nations. So let's talk about spaghetti bolognese. The food that we eat has always told us a lot about ourselves. In the same way that the simple biology of our tastes represents an extraordinarily detailed story about human evolution, the food that is on your dinner table every night can tell us a lot about who you are. Spaghetti bolognese is so ubiquitous in Australia that some consider it our national dish. Some might believe that Australians simply fell in love with a little-known Northern Italian dish and adopted it as our own, but that is not how this works. The dish we know as spaghetti bolognese likely originated in the USA, a product of Southern Italian migrants adapting a more tomato-based Sicilian and Neapolitan cuisine to fit an environment that had a greater and more affordable availability of American pork and beef. The name was probably borrowed from Bologna as a recognition that the dish was more meat-heavy and more reminiscent of Northern Italian ragouts than the Southern Italian cuisine at the time. Spaghetti bolognese ended up on Australian dinner tables because post-war migration from Italy saw a rise in Italian influence in Australian food, from cafes to olive oil. The rise of American cultural soft power in the same period meant that many American foods like pizzas, hamburgers, coffee, and of course spaghetti bolognese had started to become more fashionable in Australia. Before World War II, Australian food culture was far more influenced by the tea, scones, and meat pies of England. But food is not just cultural. Spaghetti bolognese tells us that we have a similar agricultural profile to the USA. A wheat belt in WA, affordable beef farmed in Queensland, and tomatoes grown and canned in Victoria. We also have a nationalised economy that brings us all of these things together around the country. At a household level, it tells us that we had, at least at the time of spaghetti bolognese's rise, a relatively large proportion of households with at least one stay-at-home parent who was at home for the 2 to 3 hours of time needed to chop and simmer a bolognese sauce to feed a big family. And we also had suburban houses with a footprint sufficient to have enough kitchen storage space to keep not one but 2 big pots required to cook the dish. When I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, bolognese was a weekly staple in many households, including my own. 30 years later, its popularity has dropped significantly, not because we don't like the taste anymore, but because it quite simply has become less suitable for modern Australian life. The average household size in Australia has dropped from 2.9 to 2.4 between 1990 and 2025, meaning that large pots of simmering bolognese are far less useful for us. More of us live in apartments with smaller kitchens, meaning that it's not as easy to store 2 large pots. As someone who's lived in Japan for quite a long time, I can tell you storing a large pot is far more of a concern than you might think it is. Rising household costs means that more dual-income families and fewer stay-at-home parents means that the time required to simmer a bolognese is something that for a lot of families is now only realistic on a Saturday or Sunday. Decreased popularity of carbohydrate consumption in higher income households means that spaghetti bolognese has further shifted to being a more working class dish. And here I'm just using one dish to reverse engineer an explanation of Australian life, as well as general demographic and economic trends. But historically, the role of food and cuisine has been completely the other way round. Rather than using food to interpret lifestyle, food was a manifestation of it. And as policy, it was used to communicate health, cultural and economic information. If you were a home cook in the 70s, bolognese became part of your regular dinner time rotation because it fit with your lifestyle and it solved your problems. But if the rise of spaghetti bolognese occurred largely organically, let's look at this from another angle. What did you have for breakfast this morning? Was it toast, cereal, bacon and eggs, maybe a glass of orange juice and a cup of coffee or tea? All of these are what we might call traditional breakfast foods in Australia today, but how traditional are they really? Toast and eggs have been staples in households for thousands of years. Many countries around the world will have eaten breakfast made from leftover carbohydrates and eggs that can easily be collected and stored to be kept at hand. Bakeries open early in the morning, but we eat toast for breakfast because culturally it's a way to prepare stale bread from the day before. The spread of coffee can be traced from Africa, arriving in Europe through Venetian trade in Italy with the Ottoman Empire, and then on to the Americas with Italian migration, and ultimately to Australia through American soft power and inbound Italian migration of our own. Tea in Australia obviously came from England as a product of transcontinental trade that has existed since the 1600s all the way through to the Opium Wars. But cereal, bacon and orange juice are far more recent additions to our breakfast canon. And they give us a clearer and in some ways more worrying indication of how food policy or the lack of it can affect our lives every single day. Cereal was invented in 1863 by Dr. James Caleb Jackson, a sanatorium operator in New York who developed granola as a bland food to be incorporated into the diet of people with long-term physical or mental illnesses, primarily in the puritanical belief that it would prevent masturbation. Now, forget Recipe Didn't Eat versus Brookie, because in what might be the most successful instance of recipe plagiarism ever, his recipe was stolen by a Michigan sanatorium operator named John Harvey Kellogg. He changed one letter from granula to call his product granola. Cornflakes followed a few years later, and the rest is history. Orange juice as a breakfast food was popularised in the US in the early 1920s when vitamins were just being discovered, and it absolutely took off when one of the very first health influencers, a guy called Dr. Elmer McCollum, advocated consuming more citrus to avoid acidosis. Dr. McCollum was, of course, quite wrong, and acidosis cannot be prevented by treated by citrus, and ironically, he also had scurvy as a child. And despite his advocacy for orange juice, he is credited by some as discovering vitamins A, D, and E, but not vitamin C. Bacon had also become a breakfast food in the 1920s when a man named Edward Bernays, an ad man and nephew of Sigmund Freud, was engaged by the Beechnut Packing Company, a New York-based food processor, to increase their bacon sales. His strategy? He wrote to 5,000 doctors to ask them a simple question: can a heartier breakfast be considered healthier? Most answered positively, and this was spun into a campaign to pair bacon with eggs for breakfast. The repositioning of bacon as a breakfast food is often called the most successful advertising campaign in history, but that is not quite the whole story. You may have heard the phrase, breakfast is the most important meal of the day. That, incidentally, was an advertising slogan from Kellogg's in 1917. It might not be nutritionally true, but from an economic perspective, it absolutely is. We wouldn't be happy eating spaghetti bolognese every day of the week, but as consumers, we are more than happy to have the same cereal or the same glass of OJ or the same coffee order day in and day out. Control the breakfast market and you have consistent demand, perhaps for life. Each of these three breakfast foods may have been positioned as such in the 1920s, but they didn't truly take off until after 1933, as part of Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal, which enacted the first of the US farm bills to provide generous subsidies to stabilise commodity prices following the Great Depression. I truly cannot tell you how much I do not want to talk about American politics, but it is impossible to divorce the effects of these government policies from the political importance of the states that are reliant on these industries. America's two main orange-growing states of California and Florida account for a whopping 84 electoral college votes. That's more than a third of the total votes that decide the US presidency. Fueled by dominant market position and generous government treatment, Florida produced persistent orange surpluses throughout the 1930s and 40s, when government-funded researchers developed orange juice concentrate in the 1940s. That's when the orange juice market went into overdrive. By the 1980s, fully 1/5 of all Americans consumed orange juice every single day. The development of concentrate was a godsend for American orange growers, allowing them to make use of frost-damaged fruit and completely control production levels, regardless of whether they had a bumper crop or a terrible one. Frozen orange juice concentrate remains a listed commodity to this day. The Midwest state of Iowa has 9 electoral college votes, and its Iowa caucuses are the first test of public opinion and are considered a crucial first victory in every single American presidential campaign. It's also the US's largest producer of both pork and corn. Fans of the 1983 Eddie Murphy film Trading Places might remember that the entire film was based around the financial wheelings and dealings of pork belly futures and frozen orange juice concentrate. US farm subsidies have had an enormous impact on how Americans and even Australians eat, from the switch from cane sugar to corn syrup, to the production of cooking oils and allowing agricultural swing states to provide cheap and ample supplies of the carbohydrates and fats that form the cornerstone of the ultra-processed food industry. I'm not demonising any of these things, truly. Not corn syrup, which is not the boogeyman many of you would believe, which is not the boogeyman that many would have you believe. Certainly not seed oils, which are the current subject of an extraordinary amount of quackery, and honestly not even the processed food industry. I raise them only to explain how politically motivated policy can have profound consequences on how we eat and on our health. From imagined moral panic to an actual health crisis, ultra-processing is what took the original dour, anti-masturbatory cereals to colourful, sugar-laden morning treats targeted primarily at children. Times, however, are changing. The Chicago Mercantile Exchange stopped trading pork belly futures in 2011, a reflection of the declining relevance of bacon to the American breakfast, and therefore also to the economy. Orange juice consumption too has fallen dramatically in the 21st century over concerns with its sugar content, which is on par with non-diet soft drinks. The great problem with the declining power of food is that beyond the affordability of groceries and the economics of agriculture, there is little appetite for government to engage at a policy level with the human experience of it. Food as an economic power put human beings at the centre of policy, and now one of the principal criticisms of modern politics is that it prioritises power in the form of oil, money and information over the people for which, at least in a democracy, that power is sourced. The difficulty is that food is intensely personal. In that respect, I can understand the hesitancy with which our policymakers approach food. Not one of us in this room would feel comfortable with the government prescribing how we should eat. Food is so personal and so cultural, and importantly, so different from household to household that it is different to know even where to start. But while it might be difficult to know where to start, there is a greater risk in failing to do so at all. Where policymakers vacate the battlefield and choose not to engage on what I believe to be our most valuable policy tool for achieving positive social, environmental and health outcomes, there is a long list of influencers, conspiracy theorists and corporate interests that are desperate to fill us with fear and sell us everything from processed food to supplements based on balance sheets instead of science. I've worked with health authorities in most Australian states trying to communicate a message of healthy eating, and while they fight a good fight, the odds are not stacked in their favour. Health is one of the last areas of government where food still holds some importance in the eyes of policymakers, and at a policy level, we're just not winning. So what is the answer? Spoiler alert, I don't have it. While there's plenty that traditional diets can teach us about the power of food to communicate health, culture and economics, they aren't the solution to a modern problem. If bacon and eggs and orange juice from the 1940s and 50s and spaghetti bolognese from the 70s are already losing their relevance to society in 2025, centuries-old food cultures can be little more than an anachronism. Food is in a state of constant evolution, and our approach to it must similarly evolve. To my mind, food is far from the problem. The problem is that people have been superseded by energy, capital, and information as the sources of power. Food, therefore, far from being the problem, is in fact part of the solution. By bringing people back to the centre of policy making, to remind policymakers that our democracy vests power in those people. We most often talk about food in the context of health, but what I hope I've been able to show you is that the connections and dependencies of food are far more broad. We don't need to prescribe how people eat. Any effort to do so would certainly be met with significant resistance. Instead, food policy should be entrenched in planning to avoid the creation of suburban food deserts. Food policy should be vocal in competition law so that we can have access to affordable produce. We shouldn't talk about resources and mining separate from agriculture when they both relate to land and water use. Food policy should be found throughout the human lifespan, from childcare to aged care, and in a manner that treats it more seriously than simply asking the question of how much it would cost. Our education should focus on producing happy, healthy people equipped with the tools for life who can cook themselves a meal, rather than simply producing workers to be fed into an economic model where they can generate financial productivity but can't even boil an egg. Of course, it should play a central role in healthcare, but not just there, also in multiculturalism and social cohesion. I understand the old saying that to a hammer, everything is a nail, and as a cook, to me, everything is food. But from the basics of our evolutionary biology to the economics of what we put on the table, food tells the story of our humanity. And to ignore the importance of food in our policy landscape is to ignore the importance of humanity itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam, for that truly fascinating oration. I'm sure that you have given us much to digest. Boom, boom. I know that I will never look at my bowl of cornflakes in the same way ever again, but I do feel satisfyingly vindicated that my obsession with chocolate does not reflect a lack of self-control or discipline. It is in fact evolution, and I can blame my parents for eating it, smiling and not dying. So thank you very much for that. As is traditional with the Hugh Stretton Oration, we will now follow our orator with some commentary from leading figures. The first of our two commentators this evening is Professor Alison Coates. Professor Coates is a Professor of Human Nutrition and Dean of Research in Allied Health and Human Performance at the University of South Australia. Alison has a proven track record as a research leader in nutritional physiology, with research interests centred on diet and lifestyle strategies to improve cardiovascular, metabolic and cognitive function. She is passionate about fostering nutritional science in Australia, and in 2020 and 2021 was President of the Nutrition Society of Australia and an ex officio member of the National Committee for Nutrition for the Australian Academy of Sciences. Please join me in welcoming Professor Alison Coates.
Thank you very much, Jess, and good evening, everyone. I would also like to start by recognising the Kaurna people as the traditional owners of the lands that we're gathered on tonight and pay my respects to elders past and present. I also acknowledge Her Excellency, the Honourable Frances Adamson, and other distinguished guests here tonight. And to Adam, goodness me, what a tough act to follow. Thank you so much for an outstanding oration and for capturing the complex challenges of food policy in Australia. So what, when, how and why people choose to eat, we know is complex. We know that consumers are driven by price, availability, convenience, personal taste preferences, cultural practices, philosophical choices, and that social interactions can change what and how people usually eat. The health effects or planetary impact of food may often fall well down the list of priorities when choices are being made about what you might choose at the supermarket or in a restaurant. Now, there are those who follow an Epicurean approach, deriving pleasure from the sensory and symbolic value of food, where the focus is on quality over quantity, but perhaps not always considering the health properties of individual foods or achieving a balanced diet. For others, they may choose what they eat by making sure that they've got the most up-to-date, influential, nutritional food that they can have. And at the moment, I think we will all agree it's probably protein is the biggest one that we're seeing as an influence. For others, it may be focusing on locally or ethically sourced foods. And for others, the priority may simply come down to time availability, as we've heard about with the spaghetti bolognese, but also thinking about what's affordable right now, rather than considering whether the balance of nutritious foods is in their diet. So no matter what typically drives how you eat, there are times that convenience, the lack of options, or a strong craving, and I'm with you, Jess, on the chocolate side, that may overrule your normal processes when you think about what it is you should be eating. But empowering people with knowledge of what makes up a healthy diet and how to make healthy food choices is central to what I do in my role as Professor of Human Nutrition. And thankfully, it also aligns with improving access to and the consumption of a healthy diet, which is a key focus of the National Preventative Health Strategy for 2021 to 2030 that's been released by the Department of Health and Ageing. The Australian Dietary Guidelines are a framework for healthy eating for the general population. It provides us with evidence-based advice on a healthy dietary pattern, including the types and amounts of foods that are recommended for good health. The guidelines promote balance, variety and moderation of our daily food consumption. Importantly, the advice focuses on dietary patterns that promote health and well-being rather than recommending that you eat or completely avoid specific foods. And I think that is one of the most important parts, that it's not alienating any individual food. By following the dietary pattern recommendations, people will get enough of the nutrients that are essential for good health. But at the same time, we know that following these dietary patterns also reduce the risk of many chronic diseases, such as heart disease, type 2 diabetes, certain forms of cancer, and obesity. Now, it's important to note that the current Australian guidelines were last published in 2013. And thankfully, a review is currently being undertaken with the updated guidelines scheduled for delivery next year. The expert committee undertaking this update has identified sustainable diets, those that are accessible, affordable, equitable, with low environmental impact as a high priority. And furthermore, the National Health and Climate Strategy includes an action to consider economic, social, and environmental sustainability in the much anticipated revised guidelines. We know that there is a need for sustainable diets that are culturally acceptable, economically accessible, safe and healthy, that minimise the negative impacts on biodiversity and ecosystems, but optimise both natural and human resources. So in 2019, the Eat Lancet Commission, that many of you may have heard of, outlined a combination of food groups and intake ranges that would enhance the multiple benefits for human health and the planet at the same time. And you might have heard of this planetary health diet, or it's often called the Eat Lancet diet. It's something that is flexible for providing guidelines to a range of different food groups, and that together constitute an optimal diet for both the human health and environmental sustainability. So when we look at it symbolically, it's represented by half a plate of fruit, vegetables and nuts. The other half is primarily whole grains, good plant proteins, unsaturated plant oils, with a modest amount of meat and dairy and just a little bit of the added sugar and starchy vegetables. However, currently, when we look at the global intake of health foods, it is substantially lower than what is recommended in this planetary health diet, whereas overconsumption of unhealthy foods is high and continues to increase. And the challenge is no different when we look at Australia. The data from the Australian Health Survey that's run by the ABS indicates that only half the adult population consumes enough fruit every day. Less than 5% of us meet the recommendations for vegetables, and on average we consume twice the recommended amount of discretionary foods every day. Now we know that the challenges for achieving good nutrition across the life course are there throughout. Even when people have consumed a healthy diet throughout their life, we know that older adults can experience change in their taste, smell, appetite, and the ability to eat certain foods. And all of this can not only affect their food intake, but also their health and quality of life. And for those in residential aged care, the Royal Commission into Aged Care Quality and Safety highlighted multiple challenges in the sector in relation to food and dollars being spent to ensure nutritional, balanced diets were being offered. Now, I do have a positive note. A key outcome from the Royal Commission is a clear understanding that providers have a responsibility to ensure that these meals do meet the preference of older people in terms of taste, quality and nutrition. And from July this year, the new Aged Care Act takes effect. And I'm really hopeful that the real change will be evident as all residential aged care providers will be required to report quarterly on how much they spend on food and nutrition, and that this change leads to improvements in diet quality as well as quality of life for people in residential aged care. So working towards a food system that improves health while reducing global harm is essential in order to promote positive change towards a more sustainable future. These challenges are not going to be met without collaboration between healthcare professionals and support across different sectors, including food, agriculture, environment and health. Now, it's not a question of all or none, thank goodness, because we know that change is hard, but rather small changes will make a large and positive impact. Adam, thank you for raising the importance of this topic and for an outstanding oration.
Thank you, Alison. We really appreciate the insights that you've been able to share as a subject expert. I'd now like to welcome our second commentator for this evening, Professor Patrick O'Connor AM. Patrick has a background in research and consulting in agriculture and natural resource management science and economics. He is the Director of the Centre for Global Food and Resources and Deputy Head of the School of Economics and Public Policy at the University of Adelaide. His research interests centre around the conservation of natural resources in agricultural landscapes and systems, with a special focus on the design and implementation of markets for carbon, biodiversity and other ecosystem services. Patrick is focused on how markets cause, mitigate and can solve environmental problems in agriculture and food systems, and he works across disciplines to find solutions that can be implemented at scale. Please join me in welcoming Professor Patrick O'Connor.
Thank you everyone for being here. I'd like to acknowledge Your Excellency the Governor, and also to acknowledge all the guests, including my colleagues and honoured guests, but to acknowledge that we meet on Kaurna land and to recognise the kind of land that we meet on. So up until late in the piece before European settlement, this was a grey box blue gum woodland. So we would have been sitting here in a fairly open, grassy ecosystem, fairly replete with things to eat. So it was yam daisies, the river is only just a small distance away with fish, crabs and other things. It would have been seasonal, people move up and down the river to different watercourses. And as you went down North Terrace and headed down Port Road, you would have come to a granary of native grasses. As you headed to the west there, you would have come across a large area that would have been farmed for grain. That area goes to what we now call the Wheatsheaf Hotel, which was one of the first hotels in the state built as we converted that grassland to an annual grass for wheat. And that change is the beginning really of a radical change that we've made through agriculture for our food systems that is driven by an intent towards a good outcome, a people-centred outcome, but it's, as Adam has said, and in his fantastic oration, pointed to the fact that many of our behaviours are revolutionary, that we're driven by things that come through us from our evolution, how we evolve to survive, what it is that drives us. And those things go beyond taste. So just wanted to touch on a couple of those things that, in relation to what Adam's spoken about tonight, to give a little bit of a perspective from an environmental and economics view about how do we take food policy forward in the way that Adam's helped us to think about how we get to here and what we need to be thinking about in the future. One of the critical things that drives the way that we behave is that we use a bunch of heuristics about how we think. Essentially, we think through problems, not because we have excellent information all the time, but we often have to substitute trust. So that we trust celebrities when we see them on the TV, we trust what we read in a cookbook. If it's from the CWA, we probably have trust in the institution, and we value the way that that institution has created something that will be right for my family. It will be available, it'll be affordable, it'll be sensible, and over time, relatively short amounts of time, there'll be some trial and error about making sure that those things are right. And I suspect there are CWA cookbooks evolved faster than many other things in the colonies. That trust that we use is critical to us being able to form policy. It's critical to the way that we think about problems and how we deal with the challenge. When we go to the supermarket and we pick up a package of something, we look at the information on the package. It turns out we don't look very hard. We have fairly simple rules, and we tend to trust things that make sense to us, that confirm our biases, that are easy to read and to understand, and that there's nothing that we know that is harmful. We can't know everything about it. I don't know everything about the mobile phone in my pocket. I'm fairly confident that Hezbollah mobile phones were different, so my trust is holding in my mobile phone. But the food system, we have an enormous amount of trust in that food system. I think one of the most interesting things you said about the development of breakfast cereals, Adam, is that we probably evolved from what might have been at the beginning a very interesting idea about what is a nutritious breakfast to prevent masturbation to something that then becomes sweeter, so that we have trust in the idea of the cereal, we have trust in the packaging, and then we evolve that into things that are more saleable. And we move away from that trust, and we move away from information. You know, I remember as a kid reading the back of the cornflakes packet and it said niacin, and I always wondered what niacin was. There was no way to find out. We didn't have encyclopedias long before the internet. But finding out what's in something, and you have to give a certain amount of trust to that. One of the challenges we face is that trust is under threat, and our institutions are there to uphold that trust and to help us to understand how our behaviours will lead to good results, and that's a problem. In a recent survey from the Global Economic Forum about how people in the world view economic threats and what the risks are over the next couple of years or up to 10 years, misinformation and disinformation is the biggest threat. So while what we see on the back of the packet might be okay 1 or 2 times, it might be okay over a period, it may not be great over a lifetime. And we misuse that trust in many occasions the way that we manage our food system. What's on the horizon in that same risk assessment for over 10 years is the top 4 risks are environmental. They're biodiversity loss, climate change, pollution and natural hazards. When I looked back over the last 10 years, those same 4 risks that are at the top of our 10-year horizon were at the top of our 10-year horizon 10 years ago, but they're not going up in our 2-year horizon. And that's another one of the behaviours that we've evolved, which is to discount the future. So we're not thinking about something we think things in the future will be easier to solve in the future. We're not bringing them forward to our challenges today. So if we were in the colony at early settlement, we would have met people who knew exactly how to live in this place. But we were very determined that what we understood to be our culture was to supplant it with wheat growing over using those opportunities that were here, because we have a different view about that. But it turns out we might have been stumbling around learning how to use our noodles. So we supplanted those grasses with wheats. And while there is a big population, and we can look back and we can be very positive about a lot of the innovations that we've made in agriculture in Australia, we also have not learned to come to deal with the planet. And we have not learned to come to deal with the resources of the food system and the way that we are drawn through manipulation of trust and information, the way that we discount the future, and the way that we produce things that have strong benefits to some individuals, often unable to trade those off against the benefits to a broader set of people. I think some of the things that you talked about, Adam, were very resonant for me, because thinking about how we come to do what we do is part of what the job is, to think about the economics of food systems. We are at a turning point in the way that we think about what we want to do, and I absolutely agree that we have to put people at the centre of policy. I think the challenge we have to face is that we have to put people and their relationship with the planet at the centre of that food policy. And that's a big challenge, because there's a lot of interests in the way that we do things now. But we are reaching those tipping points where it's going to be a difficult task to pull back on some of those changes that we've made, which are irreversible, and we have opportunities to prevent more irreversible change. And we have to be more aware of how we think about what we are consuming so that we can do that. One of the postdocs in my group has just published a paper, done a study showing that actually, so in the world, we produce about 11% of food is wasted. So the footprint of food is huge in terms of the resources, carbon, water and other things. When you're wasting 11% of food across the world, you are at the household level, that is, so there's other losses, but at the household level about 11% of food is wasted. That has an enormous environmental impact, and that's entirely within our behavioural choices. What Dr. Trang Nguyen has shown is that people who buy for sustainable foods, organic or somehow other way labelled as sustainable, actually produce the same amount of food waste as everybody else. The interesting thing there is that when we look at people who buy for nutrition, they waste less. So people who are buying food for nutritional purposes are actually changing the way that they shop. They are planning more before they go, and they don't buy 2 for 1, because a lot of food waste is generated by bulk purchase. So they don't buy 2 for 1, they're thinking before they go, they're using what they have, and they're using the leftover. That's the kind of thinking that we need. So we probably have a very strong journey about the sustainability of production, also important, but the global food waste carbon footprint from household food waste is 21 times Australia's carbon emissions. So every day as we throw that bit out, we are adding to that enormous potential problem. So I think part of the policy challenge is to understand how we behave. I think what you said about the way that we've evolved to behave in the way that we choose food, eat food, how our preferences evolve, how culturally we're driven, that was very, very interesting. I think how we evolve as a unit, as a collective, and how we think about the challenges that we face and tackle those challenges to bring people in their planet to the centre is going to be a great challenge, but it is an opportunity full of great potential. So I want to thank you, Adam. That was a really enlightening talk. I got a lot from that, and I look forward to the opportunity to talk about it again. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patrick. Now is a time for us to have a chance to ask our orator and our commentators questions sparked by what we've heard this evening. It's a very broad and significant topic, so I'm sure that there will be many questions amongst the audience. If you do have a question, if you could please indicate to one of our staff with roaming microphones, and we will do our best to come and speak to as many of you as possible. Who would like to start? Don't be shy. Yeah.
Thank you. That was most stimulating. I thought it was also very interesting to learn about how our dietary habits have been created by financial pressure on politicians. And in reflection on the recent election, it seems to me it might be a time for political parties to consider. There was one person who I won't name who spent an absolute fortune with no success whatsoever. And then there were the independents who had much lower budgets who did quite well. Is there perhaps a possibility that our political leaders might in turn as a result, reflecting on this, start to sort of think about the well-being of the community rather than the well-being of their fundraising?
If that question is to me, I do think there is an opportunity for that. I recently sat down. Do you have another microphone? Is this not working? I think we're back. I recently sat down with a New South Wales State MP named Jason Lee, who is the member for Strathfield, and he was running an initiative in his electorate to essentially, at a very local level, go to individual businesses, see what they can do to, I forget what the initiative was called now, but they were throwing out a few different names for it, but it was about essentially creating a healthier community. And they were going to local restaurants to see if they wanted to opt in to offer healthier versions or healthier choices on the menus. You know, if there was something that they could denote with a star that was a healthier choice. If you were going to that restaurant and you wanted to eat something healthier, it could be that. They were running mental health sessions in the community. They were doing an awful lot of the kind of things that happen at that would actually impact the health of that community really well, and food was a huge part of it, which is why I went and sat with Jason, who I've known for a very long time. I think in an election cycle, often, you know, we're focused on what wins votes, but I truly do believe that there are lots of politicians out there who, at least at a local level, are trying to do the best for their constituents. Whether that translates to something at a broader, more national or state policy level, I'm not so sure.
There's a question down the front here.
Well, that's an excellent introduction. I'm from local government. My name's Jill Whittaker. I'm from Campbelltown. We have a huge multicultural community, a great emphasis on food. We have fast food in our area, which is pizza, and all the Italian foods that are so popular, as well as many others, and the Chinese and all of the nations. But we have been trialling a program in a small area, which is to have weekly collection of green waste, and I'm coming to the points that were made later, but also it's a policy thing that we can't have weekly green waste collections, but that's because people will put their rubbish in the blue bin or the red bin if they don't have the green bin there. But I'm just very conscious now of the fact that we have this enormous problem with green waste. It's not just plants from the garden, it is also food. And we are, as a local government sector, looking to have the weekly collection of green waste. It's happening all over the city. So, is that the right policy setting to have? That's my question to probably the three of you, really. But, yeah, thank you.
If you're talking about whether to replace how green waste works to reduce to use the food waste and to be able to recycle, that's obviously important. One of the challenges with food waste is that there's no real penalty for generating more. So one of the things that councils do, and I'm sure your council's the same, is there's a pay-as-you-own policy. So if you own a house, or the ratepayer pays the cost that goes into the waste disposal, so there's no incentive to reduce your waste. So one thing that councils can do is to start to pay as you throw. So it's possible, using technology, to relatively easily measure what is in each of the bins. And if you put more weight into bins that shouldn't have that kind of weight, you can balance out how those things are used, and you can change behaviours. So changing those incentives or disincentives can help to reduce waste. But of course, having mechanisms that are able to recycle waste that can't be removed from generation is also important.
When we talk about food waste and the problems with it, I guess it's multifaceted. Firstly, there is the expenditure of resources to produce food that isn't actually ever going to be used in any positive way. And then there's also the greenhouse emissions that come from landfill. Food waste is an enormous producer of methane in landfill. There are some interesting technologies that, if you're talking about weekly collection of green waste, the next question is, I guess, where does that go, and what is being done to it when it does get taken away? If it's just going to go into landfill, I'm not sure collecting it weekly or bi-weekly is going to make a huge amount of difference. But there are some technologies around localised waste management through worms or other bacterial organisms that might be able to break that waste down in a more environmentally friendly way. At an individual level, though, the things that we can do as individuals is, I think paying for waste, the amount of waste that you produce is a really important factor of pricing those externalities into the consumer chain. But as individuals, just doing more with what we have, sometimes I think about, there's a huge difference, and I'm certainly not the least waste producing person in the world, but there's a huge difference in the amount of waste that I generate from the vegetables that I grow myself versus something that I've bought in the supermarket. So just having that level of ownership and that level of respect to an ingredient, I talked about the value of I guess power in food declining so dramatically, but the value of respect that we have for ingredients has declined dramatically as well. We're more they're cheap, we can throw them away. It doesn't affect us in our hip pockets that much. But I grew up in a culture where if something was good quality or cheap at the supermarket, people would drop it off at our house. People would drop off cherries for my grandmother, and it's a respect for agricultural produce is something that I think that we've lost quite a lot of over that time. We see it at a really transactional level rather than attributing any kind of real world value to the things that we eat.
Another question. There's one here.
Hello, thank you very much for this talk today. It's absolutely fascinating and fantastic to be here. My question is, I think I've got that funny microphone. My question relates to... My into it like this. My question is about education, starting at primary school. I watched some time ago a documentary about food and children and nutrition, and in it they showed what happens in Japan, where little children at primary school learn to grow their food, cook their food, eat their food. And so when you ask them the question, what's your favourite food, you get answers like broccoli, etc. Fast forward that to somewhere like Australia, you'd get an answer like chocolate. So what I'm interested in knowing from any one of you is how far has that sort of thinking penetrated education policy, and do you see any hope that we could have little primary school children saying broccoli is their favourite food?
Literally every single meal that we eat at home, my 5-year-old's first question is this healthy? And he asks that not because of anything that we have taught him. That's what he learns at school. I will say that he does go to a Japanese international school, so they possibly do it slightly better there. I think for most of us in this room of the age that we are, you compare the level of nutritional knowledge that we were given at school, which was pretty much non-existent, to where children are and what they're learning in school now. It is a very different landscape. I will say that my personal view is that we focus in terms of education a little bit too much on providing facts rather than providing a framework whereby people can understand the science and therefore evolve their thinking along with it. I graduated with a Bachelor of Science from here. The science has changed dramatically in the intervening 25, 30 years since then. And if I just required on the facts that I learned in my university degree, I would not really be up to date with where we are now. But the ability for a student to look at the process and the ability for them to question what they know allows them to stay up to date with that. I do think, I think about a birthday party that I would have gone to as an 8-year-old compared to a birthday party that my 8-year-old goes to now. And oh my God, what were we thinking back then? There was literally how much sugar and calories can you get into a child in a 2.5-hour period? And these days we're an awful lot better in terms of that. I do think that education around nutrition penetrates into schools a lot more than it did when I went to school, but also I do think that they, we can't leave everything up to the teachers. I personally, with my own children, I try and teach them to question things and to justify their opinions beyond just being told that you should eat this rather than eating that. So I think it's and this is why we lose out to people that want to provide quick answers and definitive answers, because a measured scientific approach of saying, well, actually it could be this is what the science is suggesting to me, will lose out in terms of public opinion with someone who's very loud and telling you exactly what something is without much regard for the nuance.
Just to add a couple of points. So there is hope, which is a really important thing to take home from this. When we look at both early childhood and in primary school, there is a real push to educate kids, particularly about 5 and 2, or 5 vegetables and 2 fruit, just to make sure that everyone's got that. And we see it with the policies that schools now have around what is the types of foods for kids to have, particularly around recess, and that the foods are eaten in the classroom before they go out and play. And when we look at Horticulture Australia and the work that they've been doing, particularly around vegetable consumption and making vegetables much more accessible in early childhood settings, it is astounding watching the change in the knowledge and kids being able to identify different vegetables. So that's where I think, if I think back to 20 years ago when I had my first cohort of second year students come through, there were a lot of times that I was talking about pulses and legumes with completely blank faces in the audience. And now they're showing me the Instagram photos of the recipes they've cooked and how they're so proud that they've been able to incorporate so many really great foods into their dishes. So I think a lot of it is because of what they're also seeing, the way that healthy foods can be incorporated, the way to learn how to cook them. So we are seeing a shift, but I think there's hope in the future.
One last question just down here.
Could I stand up? Yeah. My name's Kath Carey. I'm a retired chef and a food obsessive. There are things that I soaked. There are things. This one's too good. No, not bad. Right. There are things that I associate with food. That I just find abhorrent. Health foods. We talk about guidelines, we talk about numbers. Michael Pollan said, eat food, mainly plants, not too much. Really, I mean, what more can you ask? I'm wondering whether you can see the possibility of improving things through a behavioural change. From what I can see, little children in prams are drip-fed food practically 24 hours a day. Families, whether it's mum or dad cooking the meal, there's little Johnny doesn't like this, Hepzibah doesn't like this, blah, blah. And so you're cooking 3 or 4 different meals. People should be eating together, looking for deliciousness and having friends over to eat together. That is what I think. That's how the behavioural change should go. And then automatically all these other things would follow. You know, the shopping problems of the 2-for-1, the waste of food, absolutely, is horrific. So do you think we also need to incorporate, as well as healthy guidelines, perhaps some cultural and behavioural changes?
100% agree with everything you've said. A lot of the work that we do is focused on the Mediterranean diet, and a key element of that approach is not just the food, but the value that food is given within culture, that people do sit down together, and it's the time spent valuing food and friendship that really is central to the way that food is eaten in that culture. I could not agree with you more. But as you said, behaviour change is difficult, and when we think about the very readily available foods that are currently in our supermarket, we have to educate people about how they can shift their time use so that making food becomes part of their normal routine, and that food that looks like food, the way it was grown, is valued.
I also completely agree. I think it ties to quite a lot of the things that we've, all three of us have spoken about tonight. One of the things that we have done with modern food is we've removed, particularly multicultural food, removed a lot of the informational context from it. I grew up eating mainly Chinese food, and as a food writer, the number of times I hear people say, Chinese food is there's so much deep fried stuff, and it's so oily, and it's got so many sweet sauces. I'm like, this is not the food that I grew up eating. The food that I grew up eating was very, very different. And I'm a huge supporter of multiculturalism as a first-generation migrant. But when we have this ability to cherry pick sometimes foods from all over the world, the idea of a balance in a diet, when you say diet, I mean that the sum total of the things that a person or a community might eat gets very, very skewed. And as Patrick was saying, when you have this idea of trust in what a thing is, we know what a capsicum looks like, we know what broccoli looks like, but when you get into the processed foods, I'm not one of those people that thinks that processed foods are inherently all bad. The thing that makes processed foods very difficult is that we have no ability, there is no heuristic or bias that we have when we look at a packet to know what is in there until you read the precise things on the back of that label. And the processed food industry is one that is very, very clever at getting you to believe something that is very different. You know, go and Google what biodynamic actually means, and it's probably very different from what you think it means. Labels that are green to make them look more natural. You know, there's nothing inherently bad about combining together proteins, fats, and carbohydrates into something that then somebody eats. But if you have no ability to understand without a relatively detailed scientific knowledge and at least the ability to read a label very, very carefully, it's very difficult to understand what that is. You know, Michael Pollan also says, cook things that your grandmother would recognise as food, and that's a very pithy way of saying what I said in quite a lot more words than that. But I think removing that information context from food, whether it might be cultural knowledge or visual knowledge or a heuristic that you might have to understand whether something might be good or bad for you, leaves us as consumers in a really difficult situation. Because where we used to be able to rely on just cooking in the way that our parents cooked or our grandparents cooked, we now have to essentially come up with a whole new system or structure of eating for every single individual here in this room. And that's very, very difficult to do.
Unfortunately, that is all that we have time for this evening in terms of questions. I'd like to ask you to please thank our panellists again for their time and insights this evening. To bring the evening to a close, I'd now like to invite Emeritus Professor Adam Graycar, the inaugural Director of the Stretton Institute, to deliver the closing remarks.
Well, I'd like to thank our speakers. I think we've had a terrific set of talks. A lot of things have sort of opened a lot of ideas, and most importantly, Hugh Stretton would have been proud tonight. He would have been proud on a couple of fronts. First of all, his policy work was about making people live better, improving people's lives. And what you did, Adam, was showed how food is really about enhancing people's lives. And the second point about Hugh Stretton's policy work was that policy wasn't owned by one single discipline. And what you pointed out were the scientific, the cultural, the nutritional, the political, the psychological factors that all came together. So what we've had is, it sounds like a cliche, food for thought. You know, we've had, a buffet of brilliance. We've had a smorgasbord of ideas. It's all come together in a terrific way. But one thing that really resonated was, as a policy person, what role does government play? Because we don't really know who owns food policy. Is it agriculture people? Is it health people? Is it economic people? Etc., etc., etc. And we don't want the government telling us what to eat and how to eat, as you said. I mean, I remember when I was in primary school, we all had to have a bottle of milk every day. And what that was that the policy objective, was it to make kids healthier, or was it to support dairy farmers? But one thing you might be interested to know is, since my primary school days, I have not touched milk. You know, I won't have it in my coffee, I won't drink it, I just won't have it. But what we've got is really a whole set of policy issues that are very, very much cultural. And we heard that from Alison, we heard it from Patrick as well, because it's about putting people at the centre of policy. So Adam and the two commentators, I'd like to thank you very, very much for giving us a very thoughtful evening, for making sure that we've gone away thinking about issues and we're full of ideas. So thank you kindly.